What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to talk about the big map modes in Call of Duty and whether or not it's time for them to move on and just scrap it. Now when I talk about big map modes, I'm talking about modes like Ground War or Fireteam from Black Ops Cold War. I'm not talking about Warzone, just to make that clear. That's its own separate thing. I'm talking about the part that's actually attached to the paid version of the game. And lately, especially with Modern Warfare 3, it seems the developers are just abandoning this mode completely. And I have to assume there's a good reason behind that. So far, with Modern Warfare 3, we have access to the exact same Ground War maps now, 4 seasons into the game, as we did in the beta build of the game. In fact, they didn't even bring the Modern Warfare 2 Ground War maps and carry those forward to Modern Warfare 3 like they did with many of the multiplayer maps for Modern Warfare 2. And this leads me to believe that Ground War probably wasn't very popular at all with this game right from the beginning. Like sure, in the game's current state, you could easily make the argument that Ground War isn't popular right now because they haven't supported Ground War at all, and why would people play a mode that isn't being supported? And if you've already been playing the same 3 maps to death since the beta of the game, why would you continue playing that even if it's something that you wanted to play? So I totally get that argument, but at the same time, if Ground War was popular early on in the life cycle for Modern Warfare 3, I have to think that they would have tried to at least put some support there. At the bare minimum, I would have thought that they would carry forward those Modern Warfare 2 maps, and they haven't done that, which does lead me to believe that this likely wasn't popular from the beginning, and therefore they just made the decision to not support it at all and focus all of their efforts on 6v6. Which, by the way, we've been seeing incredible support content-wise for 6v6 this year. I think this is the most we've ever seen post-launch in a Call of Duty game. So it's not like they're not supporting Ground War because they're just not supporting the game in general. It really seems much more likely that they're pouring everything they've got into the 6v6 side of things, rather than dividing the resources across multiple modes. And for me at least, as somebody that grew up with Call of Duty and considers 6v6 Call of Duty to be the core of what Call of Duty is, I'm quite happy to see that this time around. And don't get me wrong, I do think Ground War was a solid innovation back with Modern Warfare 2019. I think it played quite well in that game, at least with most of the maps. I think there were a few maps here or there that were really not very good in my opinion, but many of the maps, especially the launch maps for Ground War, I thought played great. But I also think a big part of what made it successful was that many players, like myself, didn't like what they did with the 6v6 multiplayer for that game, and therefore it just offered an alternative, something totally different to play, and it was a very unique feeling mode while still having the general mechanics of a Call of Duty game. So it offered a great escape from the 6v6 experience, and honestly, back in Modern Warfare 2019, I played more Ground War that year than I did 6v6. Since then, however, Ground War and large-scale modes like it, like Fireteam and Cold War for instance, they just haven't quite hit the same for me. And I could be wrong, but it does seem that fewer and fewer people are interested in modes like that as the years go on. I really think that mode peaked back in Modern Warfare 2019. And that's not to say that it doesn't have a player base. I think there is still a fairly dedicated player base where that's really all they want to play is those big map modes like Ground War or Invasion. But I think relative to the general player base of Call of Duty multiplayer, it's probably a very small percentage that plays that, while likely taking up quite a few resources. Not only in development resources to create those large-scale maps, which I know they generally just pull those sections from the Warzone map, but I'm sure it's not as easy as just highlighting the area you want from the Warzone map and then hitting copy and paste, and now you have a Ground War map. There's probably a lot more that goes into that. But even ignoring the development costs and resources that go into that, there's also these space considerations. A Ground War map is likely taking up a whole lot more space to download compared to 6v6 maps. You could probably fit a good handful of 6v6 maps in the same amount of space that a Ground War map would be taking up. And that's also possibly why they didn't carry over the Modern Warfare 2 maps into Modern Warfare 3, just to keep that Modern Warfare 3 specific download size at an almost reasonable level. I know a lot of people already consider it to be unreasonable, so maybe they didn't want to push that even farther. So with all of that in mind, and with the apparent failure of Ground War style modes in Modern Warfare 3, it does have me wondering, is it time to scrap those big map modes entirely, instead of doing what they did with Modern Warfare 3, which is have the mode, but then never really support it beyond launch? And at that point, it just seems like a waste of resources since people will just fall off if you're not supporting it. So when it comes to Black Ops 6 this year, for instance, I'm honestly hoping they don't have a Ground War style mode, or Fireteam, I guess they would probably call it, coming off of Cold War, just so they can focus all of their attention and all of their energy on making the best 6v6 experience possible. Because that's another thing I haven't really touched on yet with this topic as well. I feel like over the past several years, like since Modern Warfare 2019 came out, Call of Duty has really tried to spread everything as thin as possible to reach out and capture as many different types of players as possible. It tried to offer a little bit of everything, But in the process, none of those individual modes, at least multiplayer-wise, seem to get a ton of love and focus like we were used to seeing back in the day, when pretty much everything, at least on the multiplayer side, was focused on 6v6. And so far, based on what we've seen with the marketing for Black Ops 6, there hasn't been any mention of any large map modes like Fireteam, for instance, or Ground War. And while it is still possible that they are cooking that up in the background and it just wasn't going to be a focus of their initial reveal, part of me is thinking that if they were going to have a big map mode like that, they would have at least mentioned it somewhere in that big reveal. On the flip side of that, something they did briefly mention is Faceoff will be returning, and that's something that I'm totally on board with them focusing their efforts on, because that appeared to be very popular back in Cold War, for instance. And just for a recap, Faceoff is that small-scale 6v6 mode where you're playing on like 2v2 gunfight maps, but it's 6v6, and there are no streaks present, so it's just purely chaotic gun-on-gun action that many players seem to like. I mean, there's a reason Shipment 24/7 is so popular all the time. Many people just like that mindless gun-on-gun chaos, where you don't have to think and there's very little time between gunfights. If you die, you just hit that respawn button and you find a gunfight within 5 seconds. And since modes like that seem to be far more popular with the community than the large-scale modes, and with them being very small-scale, they're probably quite a bit easier to develop than Ground War maps, and I'm sure they take up significantly less space as well. It just seems like a no-brainer to pour more effort and more attention into that, while reducing or even eliminating support for the big map modes that seem to attract a smaller player base with more development resources required. So for me at least, my big hope for Black Ops 6 is they're going to focus all of their attention on 6v6 as well as Face-Off without even thinking about any big map modes. Just scrap that entirely. One thing I'm totally on board with is an old school Ground War mode where it's 9v9, or lately it's been more like 10v10 on these 6v6 maps, and then perhaps you have to cut out some of the smaller 6v6 maps, so it's just the larger ones. That I think is great, and I definitely would love to see that return and be supported as well. But when it comes to those big map modes like Fireteam or Ground War, or even the combined arms modes that they had in Cold War, where they took 6v6 maps but then sort of expanded them, or I guess they started with a bigger map and then shrunk them for 6v6, that again just seems to fragment things unnecessarily, and I'd rather just see 10v10 played on some of the bigger 6v6 maps. Now, of course, these are just my opinions, and I am just looking toward Black Ops 6 at this point. Looking even further to the future, perhaps Ground War should return in an Infinity Ward Call of Duty game. I think that's one area gameplay-wise where Infinity Ward tends to handle things better than the other studios, probably largely because this style of Ground War is their baby. It's something that they developed from the beginning. So I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to Ground War being that thing that Infinity Ward does. But at least when it comes to Treyarch Call of Duties, and honestly Sledgehammer Call of Duties after seeing what happened with Modern Warfare 3, I would rather they just keep Ground War out of the equation entirely and focus all of their efforts on the core multiplayer, which is 6v6. Now, of course, these are just my opinions, and I realize they may be a little bit controversial. I know there's probably a handful of you watching this right now that are really dedicated Ground War players. That's the only mode you really want to play. You don't care for 6v6. And I get it, it probably doesn't feel good to see people talking about scrapping the mode that you want to play. But if we're looking at the game as a whole and where resources should be going based on where the player count is, it does seem like we're at a point where Ground War just isn't necessarily the best route to take, at least for non-Infinity Ward Call of Duty games. Now, of course, at the end of the day, these are all just my opinions, and I'd love to hear from you guys in those comments down below. Do you think that going forward, Call of Duty should just be scrapping those big map modes and focusing more on the 6v6 and possibly like 2v2 side of things? Or are you on the other side of the fence, where you think they should just try to support as many things as possible, even if it means they're not capable of putting as much support into each individual area? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.